Hey, so this video is going to be a little different. I recently put out a couple of polls exploring the idea of doing actual political history, such as the Democratic-Republicans and Federalists, and this is the first in that series. This won't be an every week type of video, just something to keep the content fresh. This particular video will go over the first party system, but for future videos I do hope to go over specific parties and their general history. Now, one of the most pivotal questions in early American history was always the size of the federal government and how much power to give it over the states, a debate that has been reinvigorated in recent decades. It is such an old debate that, in some respects, it has been ongoing since the earliest days of our country, with the Federalists and Democratic-Republicans debating every other sentence of the Constitution, all the way from ratification until the latter collapsed in the 1824 election. Now, the first party system has its origins not just in the personalities of Hamilton and Jefferson, which we'll get into, but in the ill-fated Articles of Confederation. These, I don't know and I don't care, was the first attempt at an overarching government for the US, and frankly, it made the Holy Roman Empire look like a cohesive and centralized state. The version of the US created by the Articles had no means of federal income bar the states politely agreeing to taxes, which they didn't, meaning that the federal government couldn't pay the soldiers who'd fought and died for their country's existence. This, generally speaking, is not great. It only took a decade of this to reach a breaking point with Shays' Rebellion by disaffected veterans of the Revolution, and when Massachusetts finally broke the rebellion, it was clearly hanging on by a thread, and a number of states were horrified. As a result, the Constitutional Convention was convened in an attempt to reform the government and prevent more mob uprisings. The details of the convention are something of another video, but early factions were emerging even here. The Federalists, who supported the ratification of the modern Constitution without amendment, and the Anti-Federalists, who either demanded amendments or were fine with the Articles as a whole. Some of those men had a point, and some of them were okay with the Articles. Now, after the ratification of the Constitution came the actual presidential election of 1788, wherein George Washington was elected unanimously, because you'd probably have to be insane to actively run against him. What was up for grabs, however, was the vice presidential race, since that originally just went to the second place winner, principally between John Adams and John Jay, both of whom were federally inclined. Thomas Jefferson was the only anti-federalist who won any VP votes and was promptly made the Secretary of State since he had spent a great deal of time abroad in the last 15 years. As a result, Jefferson was in the room when quite a lot of things happened, and yes, I am legally required to make that reference in this video. Adams himself played a very minor role in the Washington administration, which was dominated by the Hamilton-Jefferson rivalry, but he was very active in his duties on the Senate, more so than most vice presidents since. While Washington was our only nonpartisan president to date, it is pretty well accepted that he was more inclined to listen to Hamilton than Jefferson. This is admittedly some conjecture, but I think this is due in part to Washington's experience in the Army, which he shared with Hamilton. Both men would have experienced the failures of the Continental Congress much more heavily than Jefferson. They constantly had to deal with Congress's failure to pay soldiers and supply them, and then they saw the Articles fail their men in peace. Any officer with an ounce of respect for their men would denounce those bodies and their spiritual successor. Regardless, while Old George was almost a de facto Federalist, he did attempt to maintain balance. He was very reluctant to make use of his presidential veto, only doing so twice. According to History.com, yes, that history, the website is better, I promise, one of them was an apportionment bill for the House of Representatives that favored the North, the veto of which led to Jefferson proposing the more mathematical method we use today, and a bill that would have reduced the amount of cavalry in the army. Shockingly, the president, renowned for his military service, probably didn't like the idea of Congress controlling that facet of the state. Similarly, the subject of both a permanent capital for the Union and the absorption of state debts into the national were subject of hot debate, and it took a compromise between Jefferson and Hamilton to get the others' backers on board. Hamilton would support the Potomac capital, and Jefferson would call for the South to allow D.C., well, still New York at the time, to take on the state's debts from the Revolutionary War, which was a crucial step in creating a centralized budget. However, as Washington leaned more and more on Hamilton's economics, including a large tariff in 1789, a national bank to manage the nation's credit, and the infamous whiskey tax, relations broke down between the president, Jefferson, and James Madison, engendering opposition to Washington, referred to oh so very usefully as the anti-administration party, and represented here by the Democratic-Republicans because that's what they became in like 3 years. Oh, and for clarity, the Democratic-Republicans didn't really call themselves that for the first several years, generally using Republican. You see the problem with using that name, though. Regardless, the anti-administration group blocked a lot of Hamilton's further programs from 1792, crystallizing his own coalition into the Federalist Party. Also, Washington won unanimously again. In fact, he won more unanimously because a few states hadn't actually ratified the Constitution at the time of the 1788 election, while they had done so by 92. The president continued to lean toward federalism after the French Revolution got a little too radical, and denounced the Republicans as supporting mob rule and chaos, which led to Jefferson viewing him as too partisan, a complete shock to the nonpartisan reputation that's been cultivated around him since. Now, we're going to skip ahead a little bit to 1796 and the presidency of John Adams. Adams was the first and only president elected under the banner of the Federalist Party, largely as a de facto successor to Washington. However, his presidency would be mired in controversy that would undermine the Federalists for the rest of the party's history. First and foremost, despite both being anti-slavery nationalists, he and Hamilton fucking hated each other and vied for control over the party for Adams' entire term, with Hamilton opposing the man's re-election. In addition, his support for Britain and the rising tensions with revolutionary France, as well as the Alien and Sedition Acts that targeted citizens and journalists overly critical of the administration, made the party seem elitist and undemocratic, which would lead to their demise in the South, which at the time was the more populated region and, generally speaking, was harmed more by these attacks. Now, a lot of the partisan evolution around this point was happening behind the scenes of the presidency. In the 1800 election, the two parties were more or less solidified as institutional bodies and needed formal ways to nominate their candidates so as to avoid splitting the vote. Well, more than they kind of had to because of the whole VP situation. And the initial solution to this was the Congressional Caucus, wherein sitting legislators met to handle the nomination of their candidate, in contrast to the much more accessible conventions that emerged in 1832, wherein governors and state-level representatives are invited, and of course the primary system we use today. Mostly. Now, because this wasn't an official congressional meeting, we don't really know if the parties had unified caucuses in 1796, but we do know they did so in 1800. The Federalists, however, failed to do so again. 1800 also saw a very bitter campaign between Adams and Jefferson, with the Federalists decrying the Republicans as amoral and atheistic. Wikipedia also claims that there was a special emphasis on adultery in these attacks, but that's all linked to books that I can't access. It makes similar statements regarding an attempt to co-opt the 4th of July and George Washington's very face. Also, adultery probably is not the smartest attack to level at your opponents there, Hamilton. Oh, and he was still vying for control over the Federalists at this point, and even tried to rig the election so that Adams' vice president, Charles Pinckney, would win the Oval Office, which didn't work. Jefferson proceeded to narrowly win the election. Now, this was a very big deal because it showed the transition of power could peacefully be held across party lines, even between an incumbent and a challenger. This was, and remains, a very big deal. However, for the sake of my sanity, I'm going to focus on the rise of Jeffersonian democracy. Jefferson generally believed the government to be a necessary evil at most, idealized the yeoman farmer, and disliked the idea of national infrastructure projects. At this point, we take it for granted that a lot of infrastructure in the states is paid for, at least in part, by the federal government, but this was a very serious debate at the time because if Congress paid for it, then Congress could tell the states what to do with it. Generally speaking, Jefferson favored the strictest possible interpretation of the Constitution regarding federal power. Although, funnily enough, I would consider him one of the more forceful presidents diplomatically, at least prior to the 20th century. His famous embargo on Britain and France was to get them to stop attacking American shipping, and he launched the first naval action abroad into the Barbary states of North Africa. I guess the tradition of someone fucking with our boats and getting smacked up is even older than we thought. There's an undercurrent I've neglected to mention up until now, the Virginia dynasty. Of the first 5 presidents of the early US, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, 4 of them were from Virginia. Up until the 1810 census, Virginia was the most populated state in the Union, and it didn't fall out of the top 3 until 1840. Getting into my own views of the trends at the time, this meant that the people of Virginia had some weight in defining what populism, or as Washington would call it, democracy meant, and the average Virginian fell very neatly into Jefferson's idealized yeoman farmer. While it was the most populated state, it wasn't as urbanized as other ones. Richmond was only the 12th largest city in the country, already outranked by Charleston and New Orleans, which wasn't even part of a state yet. Now, in that 1810 census, about 40% of the US population falls below what would become the Mason-Dixon line, and at this point the Federalists have already shown their weakness in the South and have started leaning into anti-slavery ideals up north, weakening them further. So the Southeast was always going to support the DRs, especially Jefferson and Madison's first term. This then links early populism in the US not just to the yeoman farmer, but specifically to lower tariffs and free trade, as well as cementing that coalition with states' rights until the 1880s and the Progressive Era demanded federal intervention and reform. But that is very much a story for another time. Getting back into party politics, Jefferson's re-election was a cinch. Without Hamilton, the Federalists were stuck upriver without a paddle, and Pinckney only won 2 states. In general, despite the Republicans being the ones who called for a decentralized government, they had a much greater degree of party organization than the Federalists. Going back to the 1810 election for a bit, according to James Broussard's 1941 book, The Southern Federalists, while the South Carolina Federalists, yes, they existed, I promise, were communicating sporadically with Hamilton and were interested in his attempts to have the Pinckney upset, the North Carolina Federalists, who the entire scheme relied on, were in the dark and loyal to Adams. Add in that the Federalists were pushed north by the accusations of elitism, and suddenly you've got a bad feedback loop for them. Their elitism pushes them out of the deep south, so they lean on anti-slavery sentiment to make up the difference in the mid-Atlantic and Old Northwest, but that pushes them out of the upper south, so now they're stuck and mathematically cannot win. The result of this rapidly advancing cycle is that in 1804, Pinckney won 2 states, Connecticut and Rhode Island. That's abysmal. Oh, and 2 consolation votes in Maryland. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know whether or not you guys like this kind of content. Like I said at the top, this is pretty experimental, so that feedback is especially important here. Thank you, and let's get right back to the show. In addition to moves like the Louisiana Purchase and the enshrinement of Jeffersonian democracy into American political thought, his presidency largely coincides with the first major upheaval of franchise in American history. According to the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, at the time of Jefferson's election in 1800, about 80% of the white male population in the US could vote. While Jefferson's ideology would prevent him from using federal power to push this number further, he certainly made use of this newfound populism himself. Like I mentioned, the 1800 election was nasty, and Jeffersonians made it no secret that the Democratic-Republicans were in favor of the democratization, while the Federalists called them anarchists for expanding the rights of the people. However, Jefferson also failed to safeguard the rights of free black men across the South, and in 1800, New Jersey stripped the rights of women to vote. While it would be remiss to blame either of these on Jefferson, it does seem pertinent to note that his ideal society was dominated by a yeoman farmer who owned his own land and worked his own soil, unimpeded by the federal government. And if states can decide that women and black men can't own land, then who's Jefferson to stop those same states from deciding they can't vote either? Jefferson chose not to run for re-election in 1808, honoring the 2-term precedent that Washington set. Technically, Adams also did this, but he didn't exactly have a choice in the matter. The dying Federalists ran Pinckney again, and to be fair, they did far better. Oh, they still got crushed with less than 40% of the vote, but again, 2 states and pity votes. Personally, I'm chalking a lot of that success up to the disaster of the Embargo Act, which effectively cut the US off from the world economy for the last year-ish of Jefferson's term. Shockingly, stopping damn near every import and export to your largest trade partners by a country mile isn't good for business, and New England rebuked it. In contrast, the DRs chose James Madison, a friend and close ally of Jefferson. Now, Madison is one of the more important presidents for this video. Not for the War of 1812, of course, that was a mess, but for how he handled the peace. Madison originally intended to continue his policy with Jefferson: limited government, a lapsing of the National Bank's charter, and a downsized army. However, as tensions mounted with the British Empire over impressment and whether or not Canada was really America, it became clear even before the conflict that these policies had made the war harder than it needed to be. After the Treaty of Ghent, this was even more true, and the president made a stark change politically. He began to favor tariffs and proposed a second national bank, with some opponents believing he went further than even Hamilton. This transition to a nationalist mindset from Madison came at a great time, as it allowed many Federalists to begin slipping into the Democratic-Republican Party. It is worth noting that in 1812, the Federalists endorsed New York Governor DeWitt Clinton as their de facto candidate, but he was not a member of their party. Though other than a love affair with the Erie Canal and supporting New York's gradual abolition of slavery, I can't find much on him, so I don't know how Federalist he was. Anyway, while Madison switched to economic and political nationalism would save the career of many Federalists, the party itself was in its death throes. The War of 1812 had been immensely unpopular in New England, which by this point was the only region the Feds were even remotely viable in, and even that was in decline. To protest the war, leading men from all over the region met in Hartford, Connecticut, to put forward a list of demanded amendments to the Constitution, or New England would secede. I'll do that video eventually, maybe. Anyway, the Hartford Convention sent these demands too late. Andrew Jackson's victory in the Battle of New Orleans and the preservation of American territory had created a wave of post-war nationalism. As a result, threats of secession by the choking opposition party looked a lot more traitorous than was ideal, which was bad because it was already treasonous. As a result, 1816 was the last time a candidate ran under the label of the Federalist Party, Rufus King. However, he got utterly smacked, carrying only 3 states, losing to James Monroe of Virginia. Now, Monroe is interesting. He viewed political parties as detrimental to the very idea of free government, both Democratic-Republican and the Federalists, and thus refused to appoint a Federalist to his cabinet despite some pressure from both sides of the aisle. In addition, during his tenure, many Federalists continued to jump ship to the DRs, with the party effectively dead by 1818 and 100% dissolved by 1820. In addition, while Monroe was a proponent of tariffs and ideologically supported federally funded infrastructure, he opposed congressional control over that infrastructure and considered a lot of it unconstitutional despite himself. A quote from the man himself when vetoing an infrastructure bill: "Having duly considered the bill entitled an act for the preservation and repair of the Cumberland Road, it is with deep regret, approving as I do of the policy, that I am compelled to object to its passage and return the bill to the House of Representatives, in which it originated under a conviction that Congress do not have the power under the Constitution to pass such a law." a power to establish turnpikes with gates and tolls, and to enforce the collection of tolls by penalties, implies a power to adopt and execute a complete system of internal improvement. A right to impose duties to be paid by all persons passing a certain road and on horses and carriage, as is done by this bill, involves the right to take the land from the proprietor on evaluation and to pass laws for the protection of the road from injuries, and if it exists as to one road, it exists as to any other, and as to as many roads as Congress may think it proper to establish. A right to legislate for one of these purposes is a right to legislate for the others. It is a complete right of jurisdiction and sovereignty for all purposes of internal improvement, and not merely the right of applying money under the power vested in Congress to make appropriations, under which power, with the consent of the states through which this road passes, the work was originally commenced and has been so far executed. I am of the opinion that Congress do not possess this power, that the states individually cannot grant it, for although they may assent to the appropriation of money within their limits for such purposes, they can grant no power of jurisdiction or sovereignty by special compacts with the United States. This power can be granted only by an amendment to the Constitution, and in the mode prescribed by it. Monroe's time is often called the era of good feelings for a number of reasons. The economic boom the country enjoyed from 1817 to 1819 coincided with his election very nicely, but the most relevant for our purposes, the lack of political partisanship, is also the most inaccurate. While the Republicans were ascendant, they were also increasingly divided. Since Madison's turn toward nationalism in 1815, Federalists had begun switching parties in droves, and Monroe, through his policy of snuffing parties out via neglect, had enabled this more than he'd hampered it. As a result, while the names on the ballot were both officially Democratic-Republicans, they were increasingly growing apart. In addition, the Missouri crisis had stoked sectionalism back up, something that previous presidents had been very careful to avoid. Monroe, a Southern slave owner, took the side of the South and opposed any limitations on Missouri's entrance to the Union, though he did eventually agree that the Mason-Dixon line proposal was probably for the best. Which, agree to disagree there, James. And not just because I think slavery is abhorrent. Monroe was re-elected unanimously in 1820, the only president to pull that off since Washington himself. However, this would also be the last time the party mattered. After all, if everyone's a Republican, no one is. In addition to this, by 1824, caucuses had grown controversial, attacked by supporters of one Andrew Jackson as undemocratic and prone to insider manipulation. Which, I don't like agreeing with Jackson, but objectively speaking, they were. Especially at a time when the Senate was appointed by the states rather than the people, it is scummy to let them control the presidential nomination. As a result, come 1824, both Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams denounced the caucus system and urged their supporters to boycott, leaving only William Crawford to be nominated by the caucus. But out of him, Adams, Jackson, and Clay, he's probably the least important. But for the sake of completeness, he was the most radically strict in his view of the Constitution and opposed the national infrastructure of the time. Clay and Adams were both nationalists and in favor of tariffs and national infrastructure. And then there's Andrew Jackson, who came to national prominence after the Battle of New Orleans was an utter massacre of British forces. Easily the biggest name in both the election and historical record, he was a radical populist who attacked the tariff and national bank as elitist and supported both slavery and free trade. We'll talk more about him as a person and president in a video about the Democratic Party specifically. But in 1824, he won both the popular vote and electoral college, but failed to get an outright majority in the latter, which sent it to the House of Representatives for a contingent. The House, however, was run by Henry Clay. Having come in fourth, Clay was disqualified from the contingent, but was in position to play kingmaker. A staunch nationalist and less populistic than Jackson, Clay immediately began greasing the wheels to get John Quincy Adams elected president and was awarded Secretary of State, which Jackson attacked as a corrupt bargain. At this point, the Democratic-Republican Party was effectively dead, torn apart over ideology and economics. In 1820, Adams and Jackson would rematch under the labels Democrat and National Republican, but that would quickly be replaced by Whig, so I'm just going to use them. Real talk, I don't know why they bothered with the rebrand. The only thing American and British Whigs had in common was the National Bank. However, all of that is squarely in the age of Jackson and the second party system, so will be covered in the next part of this series, whenever that is. The first party system was one of precedent in questioning what it meant to be a republic, a democracy, or even part of the United States. Men like Hamilton called for one nation, truly indivisible, while the Jeffersonians envisioned a restraint on the domestic power of that nation, even as they pushed it to ever greater heights on the world stage. They were champions of the people, at least in the states themselves, while the Federalists lauded moralistic principles and tried to tie themselves to aristocratic Britain. And in some respects, the questions these men sought to answer still haven't been reached. Where's the line between the will of the people and mob rule? How should the government, both state and federal, intervene to protect those rights? Well, I have my answers to those questions, so does everyone watching, and all 313 million Americans will have different answers still. Of course, that's all pretty sanctimonious for a video about the funny election colors. Before we go, thank you to channel member Salvatore Maggiolone. Daikami, Nebula, Japteep Gill, Nafumato, and Grimwald. And an extra special thank you to Grimwald for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you guys for watching, and join me next time as we explore another alternate world.